In this video, we're going to think about cells in a way maybe you haven't before. Maybe you've thought about them as physical machines or as some kind of biological process, but in this video, we're going to think about them as computers. So let's get started. So one of the defining features of cells is that they exhibit intelligent behavior. I'm showing this here with this white blood cell, the big glob, chasing a bacterium, which is the black dot. And hopefully what you can see is that they're behaving very differently than the sort of field of plastic beads that they're pushing their way through, right? The bacterium is running away, the white blood cell is chasing. Yet this raises a pretty big question, which is how do cells exhibit this intelligent or intentional behavior if they're really just some kind of physical system? To start thinking about this, I want to zoom out to a completely different size and length scale. And that is a flock of birds doing the process of murmuration. And I would try to define it, but otherwise, actually, I'd just say, look at the video, right? There's this beautiful, ordered, dynamic pattern that these birds form when they flock together. And what I'd like to do is ask two questions. The first is take a guesstimate. What's the size of the flock relative to the size of each bird? And then second, ask yourself, maybe, where does this pattern come from? And one of my philosophies in general is to have students and learners spend some time thinking about questions rather than me just answering them. So if it's possible, why don't you pause the video for a second and think about the answer to these questions, and then we'll come back and talk about it. So pause, unpause. Okay, so I'm assuming you have your answers. These are my answers. So if I had to guess, I'd say that the flock is about 1,000x the size of each bird. And that's because, I'm guessing it's about 100 meters across and that each bird is about, 10 centimeters across. So, I mean, it's a rough guess, but the idea here is the flock is much, much, much larger than each bird. So there's no like master bird that can be out there defining what the flock does. Instead, all each bird can see is whatever set of birds are right around it. That gives a hint as to where this pattern might come from. And where it comes from is interactions between each bird. So those M's are highly scientific drawings of birds in flight. But what you imagine in a flock like this is each bird can see its neighbors, and maybe it's got some set of rules it's following, right? It follows its lead bird. It doesn't really run into the bird next to it. And it turns out if you write out some math describing a set of birds with following some very simple sets of rules, you can actually reproduce this kind of behavior in a computer. And so where this flock is coming from, where this phenomena is coming from, is a bunch of individual birds following local rules. Let's think about one more example before going back to cells. And I realize I'm in front of things, so I'm going to hide. There we go. And the example I want to talk about is Conway's Game of Life. It is an artificial example developed by John Conway of a system that gives the sort of behavior I want to talk about. And so in this system, you have a grid where cells can either be alive, in blue as I've drawn them, or dead, white. And then time is going to move in steps. So we're just going to go step 1, step 2, step 3. And at each time step, we're going to apply some simple rules. And you might call this the rule of 3, that a cell that is alive will die unless it has 3 neighbors. And a cell that is alive or that is dead that has 3 neighbors will come to life. And so we can look at the current configuration of the grid and we can say, all right, well, what's going to happen? We can make some predictions. So for example, this cell right here, which I'm pointing out with the laser pointer, has no neighbors. And so we'd predict if I iterate time by 1 step, it will die. So I'm going to do that. And sure enough, that cell died. We can then look, say, at this after this time step, this cell right here has exactly 3 live neighbors, and we would predict it would come to life. So let's see what happens. Sure enough, it came to life. So very simple rules. If you wanted to, you could update this entire grid using a pencil and paper. But fortunately, we have computers that will do it for us. So what I'm going to do is just start running this set of rules. And something pretty cool happens. The first time I saw this, it just blew my mind, actually, that we have a very interesting, complicated pattern that's repeating up here on the top. It's complicated enough that it's not immediately obvious that the pattern is repeating, but it is actually repeating over and over and over. And then what it's doing is it's every iteration, it's spitting out these gliders. They're going to go off into infinity. So we have a very simple system here, right? White squares, blue squares, and we have some very simple rules. And yet when we iterate time, we get these really cool emergent patterns. And both of these hopefully illustrate that complex global patterns can arise from objects that follow simple local rules, right? The flock has all this interesting behavior, this big global complicated pattern that arises because birds are following the rule, don't run into each other, for example. This Conway's game of life has this infinitely repeating pattern that's spitting out these gliders. Again, some very simple rules about being alive or dead. And hopefully you see where I'm going with this, thinking about cells, because a cell is essentially doing the same thing. It's got a bunch of parts that are all packed in, interacting with each other. So this is a painting by David Goodsell, and each of the purple and blue and green things is some kind of macromolecule. And a molecule here and a molecule here, right, that are right next to each other, those can interact in some interesting way. They have no idea what's going on in a molecule over here. I don't know if that's coming through with the red, but they have no idea what's going on over here. But when you integrate over all of these interactions over time, this bacterium does stuff like run away from white blood cells. And so the idea here is, if we put this in sort of cellular terms, that complicated global cellular behavior can arise from molecules interacting according to simple local rules. So if that's true, how might we unpack this? And so a really nice way to think about it is that Conway's game of life and cells are both computing machines. And what do I mean by a computing machine? Well, they both have, at least minimally, the following computational architecture. They have some internal state, which I'll describe and define in a little bit. They can take some kinds of inputs. They have a set of rules that they apply. And then the state and the input feed into those rules and then update the state. And this is where the computational magic comes in, because you have some state for the system, some set of rules, that updates the state, you apply the rules, update the state. And right here, this is the sort of computational engine that's doing interesting things. So let's define state a little bit better and unpack this a little bit more. And so let's start with Conway's game of life. So Conway's game of life, what is the state of the system? The state of the system is just which cells are alive, right? Some of them are alive, some are dead. That defines the entire state of the system. The input, well, we didn't really talk about those, but the input might be me. So imagine that I come in and erase a cell with some, godlike, from the outside of the system. So things from the outside can perturb it, and that would perturb the outputs. That would be an input to this system. And then finally, what are the rules? It's the rule of three. If you have 3 neighbors, you're alive, you stay alive. If you have 3 neighbors and you're dead, you come to life. Everything else dies. And so when you apply these rules, what cells are alive, rule, update which cells are alive, rule, update which cells are alive, you can get these amazing patterns over here. All right, so now let's think about it analogously for cells. What are the states, what are the inputs, and what are the rules that cells employ? This is another point where I think it's worth thinking about it before I just sort of spew things at you. So if you can do it, pause the video, think about what the states of a cell are, the inputs and the rules, and then we'll come back. So pause. Unpause. Okay, so what are the states of cells? So I just listed a few here. What are the concentrations of the molecules? Which enzymes are being expressed? Those are the enzymes that have particular activities. What's the current shape of the cell? Things like post-translational modifications, which change the chemistry of enzymes. And you could just keep going on and on. But it's basically what stuff is being made in the cell at this given time. What does the cell look like? So that's the cell state. What's the cell input? Well, it's things in the environment. So what molecules are present? What's the temperature? Is there mechanical stress on the cell? Are there surfaces it can interact with? And again, we could keep going on and on, but these are things outside of the cell that are impinging on the cell in some way. And the rules, this is actually a little bit more, complex and maybe difficult to think about, but what are the rules that a cell is employing? And it turns out, I think we talked earlier about how it's like, oh, this molecule here is interacting with this molecule here and not with this molecule here. The rules that cells employ are governed by what sorts of interactions and activities are possible. So for example, imagine molecule A can interact with molecule B, like they have a surface for that, but that excludes molecule C, right? That's actually a logical statement, even though it's encoded in chemistry. So which molecules can interact? Which reactions are possible, right? If an enzyme can catalyze X going to Y, that's applying a rule. If there's X around, do something to it. You can have things like transcription factor binding sites governing which genes are expressed, allosteria, which I'll talk about in later videos, but there's a bunch of different sort of logical things that can be encoded with just the chemistry of the system. What you might imagine then is if we have the state, we apply the rules, we're going to change the state a little bit. And maybe think about it very explicitly. Imagine you have an enzyme that converts X into Y. You start out with some X and no Y. You apply the rules once, now you have a little bit less X, a little bit more Y. Right? So the rules, the chemically encoded rules, update the chemically encoded state, and you go into a loop like this, and now suddenly you have a cell that is computing. And a lot of what modern biochemistry is doing is trying to figure out how that computational engine thing works. And really, I want to pause and say something here. I'm not saying that cells are like computers. It's not like I'm saying a cell is kind of like a cell phone or a desktop computer. I'm saying a cell is a computer. Conway's Game of Life, cells, cell phones are instances of the object of computers. These are devices, or these are objects that actually make computations. In fact, cells are sophisticated enough, they're probably Turing complete, which is a special class of computer that basically can run any program. So what I'm showing is a video from a user in Minecraft who actually built a Turing complete computer out of Minecraft bricks using Minecraft physics. So basically, in principle, if you could make this big enough, it could run Minecraft itself. And that's the thing I'd like you to think about. So it is a cell. If we understood the logic of cells well enough, we understood the programming language and could manipulate it, a cell could in principle run Minecraft, or maybe a collection of cells, so there would be enough sort of computing power. But imagine that. A cell is just like a computer. It could run the game Minecraft. What this implies practically is that when we're studying biochemistry, we're studying logic and circuits and programs, in addition to all the stuff you might study in a normal chemistry class, like molecules and reactions. And so in my videos, we'll actually start unpacking that with some sort of logic things and descriptions of metabolic networks. But keep in mind that that's sort of one of the key things we're trying to figure out right now is what's the logic of cells? What's the logic of biochemistry? What's the logic of metabolism? Not just, oh, what are the parts? All right, so I'm pretty much done here. I want to end sort of summarizing things. The first is that this idea that complicated or complex global patterns can arise from objects that are following simple local rules. Birds interacting give rise to flocks. Conway's Game of Life, simple rule gives rise to these cool patterns. And of course, living cells, molecules interacting give rise to intelligent behavior. Cells compute by updating their internal state, things like concentrations of stuff, their shape, etc., in response to the environment and to a set of rules that they've encoded. And finally, a primary goal of modern biochemistry is actually trying to understand all of these programs and how they're being run by cells. Okay, so that's all I have on this. I hope it was interesting and maybe a different way to think about cells than you have before. I look forward to seeing you in future videos.